Hi folks, my name is Mike Dobbs from Reminder Publishing, and this is another edition of Government Matters. Today we're very pleased to have, once again, our State Auditor Suzanne Bump, who's going to be talking not only about the Office of Auditor and some of the recent things that it has come up with in terms of its reports and audits, but also her experiences over the past 12 years.
12 years.
Ms. Bump did not, she decided not to run for re-election, so this was sort of an exit interview. And we can talk about...
That's a great way to look at it.
Talk about some of the things that you learned professionally and personally through this process, much less what's going on with the office. Thank you very much for being here today.
I'm delighted to be back. Thank you for letting me make this part of my goodbye tour.
Okay. I just was looking online at the website for the Office of the State Auditor, and it is truly remarkable, some of the recent reports in the last couple months that have been released. And when I say it's remarkable for the sense of being a journalist and seeing some of this information that is really essential to the understanding of the workings of state government, how our tax money is being spent and sometimes not being spent. It's just, some of the stuff recently has just been amazing. And one thing in particular, we were just speaking about it, is this audit concerning the Women's Veteran Network.
Right.
And that of the women veterans in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, only about 6% have been identified as veterans.
Right.
This is really astonishing, since we talk a lot about veteran services and what we can do to help veterans. The fact that we're not even sure who are the women veterans on the state level is something that's really disturbing. How did this audit come about, and were you upset or disturbed by seeing what the results were?
Well, thanks very much for the question. Thank you for taking time to look at the website. We, as you and your viewers may recall, we don't do financial auditing. We do what's called performance auditing. So we want to know if agencies are following the rules, but then we want to know, how are you spending the money? Are you meeting your mission? And that's really what this audit was about. The reason we looked at the Department of Veterans Services women's programming in particular was that when we last did an audit of the Department of Veterans Services, we saw that their outreach in general was not good. So when veterans are discharged from service, there is a record of their coming back to Massachusetts and where they are at that time. But because we know of problems that plague veterans, particularly because of PTSD, it's important that we keep track of where our veterans are, so that someone who may be feeling healthy and vital and ready to return to the community on day one, and day two or year 2 or year 3, they may be in an entirely different place. And so having an ongoing connection with our veterans is really important to help ensure that they get the services that they need. So this time, as I say, we looked at the subset of veterans, women veterans, and we looked particularly at them because women veterans, first of all, are the fastest growing part of the veterans population. Women veterans are much more likely to be experiencing homelessness, either because of abusive relationships, or just failure to be able to adjust to civilian life, and not finding sustaining work for them, but also because, in addition to whatever are whatever other kind of PTSD, trauma they experienced in service, particularly if they were in a war zone, that they also, many of them, far too many of them, are suffering also from the trauma of having been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted while they were in the service. And as we know, PTSD does not manifest itself necessarily right away. And so we, understanding these problems that really are unique for women's veterans, we wanted to see how well various requirements that the agency had for serving women's veterans were being fulfilled. And we found that they simply were not. There was not the kind of outreach that you would expect for this population to be going on. A women's network, which was to be comprised of representatives from veterans organizations and other state agencies that would come together to serve veterans, whether it was for health care or mental health care or shelter or whatever. It just wasn't happening. And so this represented a real disservice to women who have, like all of our veterans, have sacrificed a lot in order to serve our country. And so we did this work, we published this audit. It did receive some media attention, to your point, but more importantly, really, it received attention from members of the legislature who were vastly disappointed at the failure of the Department of Veteran Services to meet the needs of women veterans. So, we were talking about, it's not, we didn't sensationalize it. We didn't hang the people out to dry who weren't doing a good job. That's not the point for me of an audit. For me, the point of an audit is to identify ways that the state government can improve delivery of services in the most efficient and effective way possible.
Well, and certainly you want to deal with the legislature because they're the ones who can actually move the needle forward on these discussions. And I'm sure that if you were breathing fire and brimstone, and that it may actually have a negative effect with some people.
Right. Right, and that's why I campaigned saying that I saw audits as tools to make government work better, not weapons to bring a person or a program down. Because first of all, I don't think that's the way you build public trust, but it does question, it does call into question what your aims are. Why are you conducting audits? Is it for your own greater glory, or is it because you really want to get into the nuts and bolts, the whole behind the curtain way that government works on a day-to-day basis? So that's a choice. That's a choice that I've made. It means we've done a lot of wonderful things in the office that a lot of people will never know about, but we all take pride in what we've done.
Let me just bring up one more recent report here about Mass Health making $91.8 million in telehealth payments that did not have the proper documentation.
No, and so that's a legitimate finding. As you know, during the pandemic, telehealth, which had been used minimally before the pandemic, that is, instead of going in and seeing your, in this case, we were looking particularly at mental health providers, rather than going in and sitting down, as we're doing, talking to a counselor, you could do this over a phone conversation or a video conference, and that was allowed pre-pandemic, but during the pandemic, it became really the only principal way of delivering services. And most of the providers, therapists, social workers, and the like, who were delivering these services for the first time on a telehealth basis, really were not familiar with what the existing rules were. And we did fault the agency for not doing a very good job of informing providers what the rules were for the record keeping, for prior authorizations that they may need, for how it is that you would do your billing. It just hadn't been well explained, and the providers weren't going out of their way, apparently, to figure out how to do it right.
Sure.
And, we don't, in government, though people may think otherwise, we don't just pay every bill that gets sent to us. Because to do so without examining the whole file is to invite fraud on the part of providers. So we did find. So I have a little bit. I have a little bit of sympathy because it was the pandemic and everybody was scrambling to figure things out. But nonetheless, rules weren't followed, and it's just as an admonition to the agency to provide better guidance in a more timely fashion, because we know there are going to be other emergencies during the course of our lives here that they need to be better prepared for, so that we can ensure that the taxpayers are not paying for services that were never delivered.
Well, I saw that number and it was like, holy cow.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
The other number that was in a report in October was talking about this shortfall of our appropriations for state mandates. And if I took down the number the correct way, it was like $1.2 billion.
That's right.
The issue of state mandates, whatever they might be, for whatever program they might be, has always been very politically sensitive, because municipalities will say, well, you're instructing us we have to operate in a certain manner, but you're not giving us the resources to meet
Right.
those new requirements. And if I remember correctly, this isn't the first time that you've done such an audit about shortfalls.
Oh, no. We have, in addition to the audit work that we do, this performance audit work, we have this other division, which is called, in fact, the Division of Local Mandates. And it serves two functions. One is to respond to inquiries from municipalities relative to a new law that's passed or a new regulation that's handed down by the administration. And they can come to us and say, wait a minute, under the law, and there are certain criteria, under the law, shouldn't the state be paying for this rather than our local taxpayers? And so we make legally binding decisions. The other thing that we do, though, is that we look at matters that may not be necessarily legally burdens for which the state is legally responsible, and an outgrowth of that. And so we've done lots of reports. I think one that you might be familiar with was last fall, I think it was, that looked at the East-West divide in the Commonwealth,
Yep.
and how poorly the state was doing in meeting particularly transportation needs, but also broadband needs and the like. So we do these two things. We do this legal analysis, and then we also do these in-depth reports. And so one of the things that we were looking at was, in fact, mandates that are in the law that go back, in many cases, many years, where it explicitly says in the law that the state is supposed to fund these things, and where they were failing to fund them. And so that's where we came up with $1.2 billion. And we worked across state agencies, particularly with the Department of Education and the Department of Revenue, to make sure that our figures were right. We worked with municipalities all over the Commonwealth and the Mass Municipal Association, because you're right, every year there's a question of mandates and how much local aid should be provided to municipalities to relieve local tax burdens. And we determined that on the books, the state is required to provide an additional $1.2 billion for programming that they require municipalities to provide. Again, it attracted some public notice, but more importantly, it attracted the notice of the legislature. And we made sure that the incoming Healy administration knows about it as well, so that they can have that in mind when they are putting their budget requests together in the coming year. It's all about trust. I mean, why do you care about mandates if you're the auditor? Because it's accountability. The legislature has to be held accountable as well as the rest of government. And if they're not doing something that the law requires, then they have to be put on notice. In many cases, they're not doing it deliberately. They don't know that there's a mandate. It's been on the books for so long, and they've been underfunding it for so long that they don't even think about it.
Right.
They don't even think about it.
It's the political reality.
Yeah. So you're going to make a little noise on these things. Keep reminding people. Yeah. You want to do this new thing, well, don't forget the old obligation that you already have.
Generally, have you found during your time that the members of the legislature are responsive when you point something out like this?
Right from the start, they have. Maybe didn't necessarily take all of the action that I might have thought was necessary. But right my very first year in office, which was 2011, we were looking at educational collaboratives. So school districts run their public school system, and then for special programming, and sometimes it is indeed for students with special needs, developmental disabilities, or maybe they just can't be in regular classrooms for other reasons. Or they want just specialized training. Communities will come together and form these special districts that are run by collaboratives, and they provide special education services. And there was a problem that we'd heard about with one of them, misspending, and that caused us to audit several others and found patterns of behavior that showed that they weren't accountable as they should be to the local school committees. They weren't following all the rules, and nobody was paying any attention to them. So we showed the legislature what was really going on, and within a matter of months, they had filed a law that gave more powers to school districts to provide oversight, more powers to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education to set new rules for them, and there's much more accountability now. So right from the get-go, the legislature has paid attention to what we have been recommending.
That's excellent.
Well, I think it helps that I had also, many years ago, as I say, in my youth, I had actually been a member of the legislature, so that helped. That helps, I think.
So you had a working knowledge of it.
Yeah, of how to not just get their attention, but how to help them to do their jobs better in advancing legislation.
I do want to talk a moment about, and we were talking about this earlier, about the municipal police training report, because that's really significant too. So this is another recent report that's come out.
So it was actually in 2019. Towards the end of 2019, we did our Division of Local Mandates, in fact, not even an audit, did a report that looked at state funding for municipal police training. And we were looking just at the requirement that is in the law that every police officer receive 40 hours of training annually. Not just as a cadet in the academy, but on an annual basis. And we were looking at that to find out whether the state should be contributing more to police funding, because it was a growing cost burden for municipalities. If the state wasn't providing the training, then they were having to pay for it themselves, and it was getting very expensive for many municipalities. And so we did this report, and we verified the cost burden, but then we also saw that many police officers, principally because of the cost burden, were not getting all of the training that was required under the law. And in fact, some small towns, the police were getting no annual training. And so there was a cost issue, but then there was also this accountability issue. The law requires it, it's not being done, but nobody's paying any consequences for it not being done. So we issued that report. I must say that immediately I started sitting down with the public safety folks in Governor Baker's administration, as well as members of the legislature, because we were talking about funding, but then also how do we ensure that the police are getting quality training. A few months later, George Floyd was killed by a police officer. And then it really grabbed people's attention that we needed to pay attention to police training, as what, in addition to police violence, inappropriate use of force. And so when the legislature did pass finally their reform legislation, they adopted our recommendations relative to training requirements, standardized curriculum, and a process for certifying and then decertifying police officers that went beyond just failing to meet training, but also had to do with the way they were conducting themselves on the force. So again, that report didn't get a lot of public attention, but it certainly caught the attention of policymakers and advocates who came together to say, how do we respond to the issues of police violence? And so just the other day, I went out to look at the new police training center, the main one, which is up in Wakefield, where now, for the first time ever, state police, municipal police, private hospital police, school campus police are all being trained together. Corrections officials are all being trained together, and to much higher standards than they ever had before, so that they're forming working relationships even as they are getting their individual professional training. It really is being spearheaded by a really visionary former police chief from Woburn. I was incredibly impressed. And now municipalities don't have to pay for rigorous, high quality, standardized training that addresses not just the normal policing issues that you would expect, how to serve a search warrant, how to respond to a domestic violence call, how to deal with a person, on the street in need of some help, but it's also dealing with factors of stress. The Chief Ferrulo took some delight in telling me that they even have, as a required course, yoga. As a means of, just one of many means of dealing with stress from the job. Just that, how do you decompress? How do you live a more healthy life? How do you deal with all the trauma that you see as a police officer? And it was spick and span and beautiful, and I really was so excited to see the strides in 2 years that have been made across the state.
And that's an excellent example of the work that your office does, and that it can result in concrete reforms that are going to benefit everyone in the Commonwealth.
Right. But if you say, what's the auditor done lately? People just think that it's all about numbers, but it really is about independently analyzing how well agencies are doing what they are supposed to do.
So let me ask you a couple questions. Just looking back on your tenure, was there anything in particular that came across your desk that really surprised you or shocked you once your staff came back with an audit? I'm just, because when I take a look at this, generally my eye is always opened by what I read on the website about, wow, look, I never realized this. Was any aha moments for you as you did your job?
Well, two big things. I guess really the most distressing, frankly, audit that we did involved the Sex Offender Registry Board, which, this is kind of reminiscent of the Veterans Services audit that we just were talking about. But the Sex Offenders Registry Board is supposed to keep track of registered sex offenders. And when we audited them, we found that they had lost track of, frankly don't remember the number, many registered sex offenders. And I can appreciate that not every registered sex offender is going to do what they're required to do, which is inform the board if they get a new job, because people, for certain sex offenders, people in the vicinity even of a workplace need to be able to be informed, but also if they change their residential address. So the agency has an obligation to find out where they are. And they weren't making use of their sister agencies in order to do so, even though the law told them that they should and that they had the authority to check with the Registry of Motor Vehicles, check with the Medicaid program, all of these other points of contact for citizens and their government. And the fact that they weren't doing so, when the law even told them that they had the authority to request this information, and we found a number of them ourselves just by matching against one database in state government. It was really frankly disheartening that they could have been so casual about their job and not used all of the tools that they had. It didn't even require any creative thinking. So that was probably the most disheartening thing that I'd seen in state government. But it's a problem across state government that people operate in silos and they don't look at what else is going on, even in agencies that are supposed to be serving the same group of people. People just stay in their own in their own little silo. And so that's one of the things that we have made a point in a number of our audits to advocate for, is using more information. State government collects a lot of information, and it is getting increasingly easy to analyze that information and to integrate one agency's database into another, so you get a much deeper insight into what's going on. This is why it doesn't get in the paper, because this gets kind of in the weeds. Yeah,
well, I'm a policy wonk kind of guy, so actually I get involved and get interested in this.
Yeah.
Why did you elect to toss in the towel at this point? Was 12 years enough?
Yeah. There's still so much more that I could do in the office, but quite honestly, this is the longest. It's 12 years. It's the longest I've ever spent in any job. There still is challenge and mission that appeals to me, but I just felt that it was time to let somebody else have a crack at it. See what they can bring, because there are more tools that are becoming available, data analytic tools and other kinds of communications tools. And I just want to make sure that the office stays fresh.
So is there a transition period between your administration and the new auditor coming in?
Yes, so we prepared, we spent a number of months preparing a book on everything we do and how we do it, so that the new auditor won't be blind. She'll have an understanding of what goes on in the office, and therefore the kinds of skills, if she's going to change personnel, that she's going to need to bring into the office to help it going forward. We have just recently started to have some meetings based on their reading of the transition materials, and gotten to the point of their asking questions of us and the like. So she'll be as ready as she can be by the middle of January when she takes the oath of office.
Well, congratulations on doing a job that is not necessarily acknowledged by the public. I think, unfortunately, most people, and this is not a criticism of you or your staff, but I think most people are not aware that there's such a thing as an auditor until election time rolls around,
Yeah.
and suddenly there's a group of people running for this thing, and one of their biggest challenges is to explain what it is. But simply, I think people, if they're concerned about what's going on with their tax money, simply going to the state website and
Right.
putting Office of the Auditor in, it's very eye-opening, because all of your reports are there, and they're presented in such a way that even a dumb old journalist like myself can understand them. But there's a lot of very, I think, pertinent information that is presented by your office on that website that the average taxpayer would have some insight from.
Thank you for the compliment on the website. I mean, everything that we do is on that website. In addition, in order to have that kind of transparency, I will tell you that when I took this job 12 years ago, the media was very different. And we actually, for the first few years that I was in office, received a good deal more attention, principally because there were more local newspapers. The demise of local reporting has meant that there are far fewer outlets that are covering state government, and an audit is not going to make it into the newspaper if it's competing against Charlie Baker and the pandemic. So I think it's, and really the public has no one to blame but themselves for the demise of local media, because they wanted to focus instead on what was coming in on their phones, which was largely entertainment and opinion, rather than actual news. And so if nobody's buying those papers, then you can't invest in the reporters to cover topics in government at any level. So I think we have a less informed, increasingly less informed electorate. They may be deeply informed about particular issues, but the breadth of issues
Right.
has really shrunk. It's
Well, if you
it's
ever
a
want
cause
to
of
talk
great
about
concern.
this in depth, I'll be happy to buy you a beverage, and we can talk about the problems that do come about governmentally because of lack of serious coverage.
Right.
Not just coverage that is of something sensationalistic, but something that's actually of substance.
Right.
And there has been that issue.
Certainly, it certainly is true. I have, I pay attention to what's going on at the local level. At the beginning of September, the town of Halifax, which is south of Boston, lost in one 24-hour span two of its three members of the Board of Selectmen, plus the town administrator, because they just couldn't take the abuse that they were getting from folks who were single issue and you're not well informed, and the town was being run by one person for a couple of months before they could call the election
Right.
and bring in some new people. And I really think it's because people, aren't getting just objective news reporting, and it makes them more susceptible to rumor and sensationalism. And then they get agitated, and we see the results all over the place.
Well, that's certainly one reason Focus Springfield does a show like this, because we want to call attention to actually real issues.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
well, thank you so much for your service to the Commonwealth.
Thank you, and thank you for the public service you're providing as well.
Folks, this has been another edition of Government Matters right here on Focus Springfield. Thanks for watching.